Okay, come on in. There's plenty of seats up the front. There's a vacant table here with lots of chocolate on it. If you want to grab a couple extra chocolates, Brian's making a beeline. While you're making your way in, you'll notice you've got your new learning guide. We've just got the next 2 weeks, so Genesis chapter 1 to 11 and then chapters 12 to 50 in this one particular learning guide. Now, for those of you that purchased one of the folders, the plastic folders, that looks like this, just bang that in. That's because included in the price is all the printing. If you don't have one of the folders, and so you haven't contributed to any of the printing, just for your own, I don't know, your own sake, I don't know if that makes sense. I'm not actually pocketing any of the money for the printing. That's all going to CYC, because for the past 2.5 years I've been using it for free. So if you want to make a gold coin donation for the printing and you haven't bought a folder, there'll be a jar at the door on the way out, and then you can drop some money in. If you don't, that's not a big deal. It's just Andrew. In fact, if there's any competing outdoor education businesses, you could maybe pocket the money from the jar on your way out, and that will send. Okay, also, if you haven't already purchased one of the textbooks, there's $50. I've got some for sale at the door. You don't have to, obviously, but for those that have purchased them, I'm confident, without speaking to anyone yet, that you've probably found them extremely helpful. So, again, if you haven't got one, now would be a good time to get one. Well, after the class would be a good time to get one. Okay, let's pray and let's rip in. Father, I want to thank you for each and every one of the crew that are here, and then also for those that are part of this group that aren't here. Lord, would you just, would they just be conscious of you present with them tonight, and would you bless us with a capacity to be really conscious of you present with us here too, that we might be able to, as always, merge this head learning experience with the heart in such a way that this stuff that we're talking about and struggling with has some kind of deep and profound impact on us as individuals, that it might be a blessing to those around us. And Lord, I'm reminded too just of the love that you have revealed to me in time spent in your word. Would that be a blessing for everyone here, Lord? I pray that there would be a greater understanding of you, and then a deepening of our love for you in this process of walking through the Old Testament. Amen. Okay, all right. Tonight we're going to be a bit rushed. So please, if I say something you don't understand and you want to understand, put your hand up and let me know. I want to talk about the things you want to know about. And so if you don't put your hand up and tell me or ask questions, I'm just going to presume what I'm saying is what you want to know, and it may not be. Also, I think I said this last week, but I had a really interesting chat with a really sharp member of the group, and they had mentioned there are a number of times where I might go on for 5 minutes and she's got no idea what I'm talking about. And she's she's exceptionally smart. And so I thought, I need people to be able to stop and go, because see, what I'm talking about isn't necessarily overly sophisticated, though I think the Old Testament is. It's just that sometimes I'm talking about foreign ideas and foreign concepts. And so at that point, it would be really helpful for you and others in the group, if you're thinking, I don't know what he's talking about, to stop me, because there'll be others in the group who'll be thinking, I don't know what he's talking about. So please, I want to encourage you to do that. I only just noticed the map's upside down. Okay, all right, well, I'm not going to bother with the map. You guys, there's only one other person in this room that would know the process that it would be to flip that over and turn it around. This whiteboard has a mind of its own, so I'm just going to leave it. If I touch it, I won't be able to fix it quickly. Okay, so we're going to do an introduction to the Pentateuch. Who knows what the Pentateuch is? First 5 books of the Bible. Is there anything in the name that gives that away? Penta, good. Like a pentathlon or something. It's 5 activities, 5 sports or something. Pentagram, 5-sided shape. All right. Now, the Pentateuch is also the Torah, and is also the law, and is also the books of Moses. Okay? There are other terms that are synonymous that I just want to make sure you guys are up to speed with. Hebrew. Hebrews can also be Israelites and Jews. Okay. Is anyone still confused how that could happen? Good. All right. Excellent. The land of Canaan. That could also be Israel. It could also be Palestine. What else? The Promised Land. The land of milk and honey. Okay. Same. Different periods of time. It carries a different name, but they can be used synonymously, and so it's just helpful to refresh this stuff. Because, like I said, Pentateuch is another one of those words that gives us I don't know, it confuses us from time to time. Now, the reason why it's called the Pentateuch, apart from the fact that there's 5 books and that the Greek number for 5 is penta, or the root of it comes from penta anyway, we need to have a very quick history lesson again, if we can, and that would have been so helpful. We can do it. Okay, so when the first 5 books of the Bible were being written, they were written by a guy who spoke Hebrew. He was a Hebrew, and so he wrote in Hebrew. But and so that's taking place at around about 1500 BC. But by what would you call it? Let's say about 300 BC. So 1200 years later, Alexander the Great has completely taken over the known world, including all the Hebrew-speaking regions. And so everyone is speaking Greek. And it's kind of like English today. Everyone sort of has to learn English because to get on, you kind of got to be able to speak it, even if you live on the other side of the world. Well, that was sort of the same. Everyone had to speak Greek. And so people stopped speaking Hebrew so much, and then the Hebrew scribes thought, well, we better write the Hebrew scriptures in Greek as soon as we can, otherwise people won't be able to read it. That's what we've done, right? When we translated the Hebrew scriptures into English. And so it became the Old Testament that was written in Greek became known as the Septuagint, or the LXX, which stands for 70, and there's a bit of a myth around 70 scholars going to different parts of the kingdom, all sitting down with the Hebrew text, translating it into Greek, and then they came back together after 70 days, and lo and behold, every single one of them got every single translation exactly the same, and so it became known as the LXX. I don't believe that probably happened. It might have. I don't know. Anyway, that's where you get the Greek term for the first 5 books being Pentateuch. If you hear someone say Torah, that's just the Hebrew version of it. If you hear someone say the law, that's the English version of the Torah. So the Torah can be translated as law. Unfortunately, when we think of law, we think of like old people or really well-educated barristers or something with the funny hairdo and the wooden hammer. What's that called? Gavel or something? Yeah. And we think of it's in a really sort of pigeonholed kind of manner. A better understanding would be like guidance or leading or something like that. And so anyway, we will probably refer to it as the Pentateuch because most of the textbooks do. But if you hear me talking about the law or the Torah, we're talking about the same thing. Now, what is it? Okay, the first 5 books of the Bible, we call them Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and they are all Greek words. Genesis being the beginning of something. But the Hebrews just called the first scroll that they had in the beginning, because the way that the scrolls came, were rolled up. And so, which book have you got? Oh, I'll just open the first bit and see. Oh, the first line says in the beginning. So it became known as in the beginning. And then every let's go there. So in the beginning is the Deravim, and then you've got the Bemidbar. All right, that's the Exodus. It would have just whatever the first 2 or 3 words of Exodus are. That's what that would be translated to. I don't know Hebrew, so I wouldn't be able to tell you. But we did have. I remember at college. So I went to college with Brad Vanderlyn, one of the pastors here, and we did have to learn all this. Like we had to memorize the Hebrew names, and the only way Brad could remember them was just by remembering the last 4 letters. So the first book, I read it first thing in the morning on the toilet on a rim. And then my favourite surf spot is D-Bar. Then the next 2 were a bit different. Ikra looked like IKEA. He bought a fish near IKEA, and so he named the fish Ikra, and so you can remember that. And then there was Emmet, was the other fish. He said that was the fish that was a bit of a slush-jawed local. And then the final one he found very easy to remember. But because we're in church, I'm not going to say it. Now, but here's what's important to understand. This Pentateuch or Torah is in the English divided up into 5 books, but originally presented to the Hebrew readers as one unified story with 5 volumes. And so where we create distinct divisions between these books, it might be more helpful to just consider one division, and that being between Genesis 1 to 11 and then the rest of it. Genesis 1 to 11 is all the prehistory stuff. All the stuff that took place way before, the Hebrews ever came into existence. But it does slowly explain how they came into existence, for sure. And then the rest of it is basically the history of how a little family who became 2 million slaves actually became a confederate group of tribes and eventually a nation. Okay, so now this is important to understand, because when we read the Pentateuch, we need to accept that in the same way, for us to be able to understand the context of any particular verse in Scripture, that it should be seen in the immediate context of the verses surrounded and the broader context of the chapter and the book that it finds itself in. In the Pentateuch, we've also then got to extend that broader context to the whole Torah, the whole Pentateuch. And a good way to explain this, I don't know if I've still got the slide to do, is to think of The Lord of the Rings. Now, I think these movies are woeful. I've tried so hard to get into it, and they're just terrible.
Shame on you.
Said like a proper nerd. I can say that to Nathan because I love him. All right. Now, here's the thing. So to think that you can just roll in and watch, I don't know, the last half of the second volume of The Lord of the Rings and then totally understand what's going on is just deluded, and we know that. Now, you could get some good stuff for sure, but you're not going to get exactly what's going on. And even if you were to start watching the first Lord of the Rings, the author, what's his name, Tolkien? Yeah. He realised that for anyone to be able to understand the story where it starts, he needs to offer the reader or the watcher a prehistory to what's going on. So the first 10 minutes of the first movie, apparently, is talking about the prehistory of hobbits and elves and whatever it is, like goblins and stuff. So for those that watch it, you're like, yeah, we totally get it. That's kind of like what Genesis 1 to 11 is. It's Abraham saying, it's not Abraham, it's Moses saying, listen, you need to know all this stuff for anything else to make any sense. And this is just so key for our understanding of the whole of the Bible. If we don't have a good handle on Genesis 1 to 11, it's like we don't really have a good anchor for the rest of Scripture to find itself its root. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, a few people to thank. First of all, I want to thank Marguerite Pollard, because she's been working like her own business and then on the side trying to get my mess that is formatted into these books looking a little bit prettier, and my slides. And so she started the process, and we've got a couple of the slides that she's been working on in this week's PowerPoint presentation, and over the course of the year, hopefully, it will all become nice and pretty. But thank you, Meg, for the start of this. I just also want to thank Rob Bridgeland for all the chocolates tonight. I don't even know if he's here. And the 4 p.m. crew who set everything up this week. I didn't even come in. It was just all set up when I got here, so you guys are the greatest. Thank you. Okay, all right, Genesis 1 to 11. That's where we're at. We've had a brief talk about the Pentateuch, the necessity to study the whole thing as a unit. The first division, though, if we were going to make a division, could be made here, between chapters 11 and 12 of Genesis. Okay. Yes?
Sorry.
Go.
You just said, just for me to clarify, maybe the only one with the question, did you say it's one person who wrote all 5 books?
Yes. Great question. So what you'll find as we go through every book from now on, the first half an hour of each class, we're going to talk about those questions. The author and the audience and the cultural context around that. And so we're actually going to get to that in just a second. But I'm presuming, because you've got a bit of prior knowledge, that this question probably will circumnavigate me having to say too much. Because you're right, yeah. The traditional understanding is that the whole Pentateuch was written by one guy. His name starts with an M. Anyone got any ideas? Moses. Okay. But if you were to read the last couple of chapters of Deuteronomy, which is the last book of the Pentateuch, incorporated into the end of the book there is the account of how Moses died. Mm-hmm. So how in the world could we think that Moses wrote that? Okay, we'll get to that. Yeah, prophetic. Yeah, maybe it was. Okay, let's just for 60 seconds turn to your table and just ask yourselves, what do we know about the context of Genesis 1 to 11? What things do we already know that are going to help us understand how to interpret this crazy piece of scripture? Okay, go for it. I need a glass of water. So, why don't we start with the numerics? It is numeric, isn't it? That's how I pronounce it? Oh, sorry, Holger. Okay. Okay, Sylvia's going to give us a bit of context around...
Okay, I do.
Okay.
The way you just said, I mean, you didn't give us much time, but it was pretty much like 10 seconds or something like that. That is actually covering like 2,500 years, which is a massive time frame, and it's then, what is it, especially in the first 2 books, just a few chapters, until Moses already arrives, and actually at the end of Genesis. So,
yeah, not until Exodus.
Like, just a few chapters spanning the 2,500 years.
Mm-hmm. Good. Anyone got anything else? It's going to help us.
What's this general questions?
Sorry, just some general cultural, historical, literary information to offer some context around the book.
It's not saying how it happened. The author's not telling us how it all happened. It's just sort of like it happened.
Okay.
It's not like the process of how it happened, except God said it. And it's not like a scientific.
Okay.
It's not scientific. It's poetic.
Okay.
What's
All right.
explaining why He made it.
Okay, so Genesis 1 to 11 seems a little more concerned with the why than it does with the how.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, if you didn't read this week and scratch your head a lot, then I want to come and talk to you because you got all the answers. This is just filled with questions. I mean, when I'm reading it anyway. Okay, great. Thanks, Jacqueline. I agree. I think it's much more concerned with the why than the how. Anyone else got anything to add? Tommy Boyd.
It was written to the Hebrews who just come out of Egypt, so it's kind of showing them the difference between their God and Egyptian gods. So, like, historically, culturally, it's saying, okay, well, you all believe that maybe, I don't actually know the Egyptian creation, it's kind of saying, okay, we've got one God, that's it, it's just kind of juxtaposing what they believe.
I think potentially the most important piece of context is to understand the audience for this book. Because you're right, this was written about a period of time like way back. And it wasn't written to the people back then, it was written to the people in the now. So we've got to find out who are the people in the now that are reading this story and what is it that they conceptualize God to be or creation to be or origins to be, so that we can weigh that against what Genesis says to actually discover what the intention of the author is. Okay, so let's do that. First of all, we need to understand that the literary genre for the book is mostly historical narrative. And so if somebody wanted to make it into a book of scientific process, they would be committing a crime. That's not how it was written. Okay? Now, incorporated is a little bit of law, like there are some commands, and that's a little bit easier for us to understand. It's from the mouth of God, do this and don't do that. I like his first law that he ever gave. Does anyone know what that one is? Yeah, I think it's Genesis 1:27 or 1 something. It's right at the start. The first law he ever gave.
Be fruitful.
Good one. Yes, because we know what is required to be fruitful. Good law. Thank you, God. All right, and then there's poetry there as well. And you may or may not have realised, but in your Bibles, most Bibles, to let the reader know that you're reading some poetry, the paragraphs are formatted in such a way that there's an indent after the first line. And so for the whole first chapter, you'll notice that's how your scriptures are formatted. It's telling us something. What you're reading is a poem. And it would be silly to think that like a poem that is meant to speak to the heart, communicate your emotions and feelings, is attempting to do something cognitive in the same way that like scientific method might be trying to do. Does that make sense? So these are little tip-offs that you can learn as you're reading through to go, oh, I shouldn't be looking for that, and I possibly should be looking for this. Okay, now, in a couple of weeks, Megs and I are still working on it. We're going to come up with a genre key so that each week you'll see a little logo which will tell you exactly what kind of genre you're reading, and then there'll be a little blurb there also to explain a bit more about the genre. But as far as narrative goes, think fairy tale. The Bible's not a fairy tale. Just think fairy tale. It tells a story. It's communicating some truths. There may be some historical truths in there as well, but that's not the purpose of it. It's to communicate like a moral or something, right? Okay, now, you see this little fella here? Have a read of what he has to say to Dad. So what do you think the little boy asked of Dad? Where do babies come from? Now, his dad could have said, well, son, Inside the testicles of men is a fertilizer called semen, and then explain the process of how that gets out, and then in the ovary of a woman is an egg, and then could have done that if he wanted, and that would have been true, and that would have been right. Or he could have told his son the birds and the bees, and that would have still been true and would have been right. But if the son is fixated on, the scientific method, and then he goes to the internet, amongst other things that he probably would have seen, he would have realised that the birds and the bees didn't suffice. And then he accuses his dad of lying, or, it's baloney. His dad never lied. He was just communicating something that he thought would speak to the mind that had asked the question. And the mind, obviously, in this case, is a young mind. So they don't understand, how a sperm is going to get up the fallopian tube. I don't know. It doesn't want to go up there, does it? Anyway, into the uterus. That's the place. Whatever it does, you don't expect that a small child is going to understand that. So you give them a contextualized story. I'm not arguing that the ancient mind is a primitive mind. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying they thought in different paradigms to our mind. And we need to get our head around this as we approach Genesis. Otherwise, we will only be left with questions. And I don't actually think the intention of the author is to leave people with questions. I think the intention of the author is to give them a whole pile of answers. Yes, up the back.
Can you tell us a story of the birds and bees?
Yeah, I'll send you a video link. Okay, so we talked about the author being Moses, and it's important that we pause here just for a moment. There's a huge debate among scholars, and if you've read your textbook, I'm sure it'll be in the chapter. There's a number of different theories around how the first 5 books of the Bible have come to us. And a very prominent theory amongst critical scholars, and so critical scholarship saw its rise mostly in Germany in about the 1800s, but it has carried on since. And the argument is that during the latter years of Israel's nation, before they went off into exile, some kings thought, man, we better come up with a history of our people, otherwise we're going to lose everything, everything's going to fall apart. And so there are good arguments to make that the one king in particular, Josiah, he had a heavy hand in getting whatever oral traditions out there existed compiled into the Pentateuch. And then books of the Old Testament were added thereafter whilst in exile, and then after returning from exile back into Jerusalem, to give a nation a bit of an identity, and a nation that had almost been utterly wiped out. Now, I don't particularly believe that that's the case, and traditionally what is put forward is that even though there are obviously parts of the Pentateuch that have been edited in, say for instance the death of Moses, the books were essentially authored by Moses. It's called the essential authorship of Moses. It's pretty self-explanatory. I like it when they give those ones though, because sometimes they come up with weird names and I don't know how they link. But anyway, the essential authorship of Moses says that he compiled the prehistory and got it sort of ordered, maybe in its poetic form, and then he also was the one that knew the stories of the patriarchs or Israel's family before they got to Israel. So he sort of ordered most of that stuff. But he had people helping and editing and chopping and changing to make sure things were ordered correctly. And one of the strongest arguments to this is, and we'll discover this as we go along, is that there are design patterns in each of the books. And the design patterns are a very common one, actually, and this is a common thread throughout all the Old Testament, is how people fall into sin. And it finds its origin in the temptation in the Garden of Eden. So Eve sees something, then she desires it, and then she takes it. Now this 3-step process is something that authors throughout the whole Old Testament repeat time and again. And so you get Obviously, David's another good example. He sees Bathsheba, he desires Bathsheba, and then he takes. And so the authors write in this process. Now, to think that every single story that sort of tries to explain how sin infiltrated a particular setting would have happened like that, and every author wrote in that fashion, independent of the other authors, is a bit far-fetched. I think that the authors and the editors of Scripture went, here's another story like that old story, and remember that design pattern? Everyone's getting to know that this is basically how the human head and heart works. And so when we document this story, let's put that design pattern in it as well. And there are design patterns from all kinds of different stories that are going to repeat time and again. And so I don't think that there's any reason to doubt that Moses was the author of these books, and there's no reason to think that if there was editing going on over a process of time, that distracts from the divinity of the books. Now, another case for this against Moses' authorship could be made in that Moses existed in a time where Pharaoh was actually not called Pharaoh. He had a different name. I don't know what it was. And so when he wrote the story, he would never have written Pharaoh because the name didn't exist. But as the books got passed down and handed down and scribes had to write and rewrite, they had to write for the current readers of their day. And so if they were going to talk about the king of Egypt way back in the day, they would talk about the king of Egypt way back in the day, giving him the title that he currently has. And the current title at that point in time would have been Pharaoh. And we do this all the time. There are geographical locations all over Australia that have Aboriginal names. And before white settlers got here, those geographical locations would have always been referred to as the names they were given. But if you have, at school we would sometimes have an Indigenous guy come in and tell a story about Currumbin, and he would call it Currumbin. He wouldn't give it its Aboriginal name, or he might want to tell us, and just as a sideline piece of information, it used to be called this. But we at no point thought that, he was trying to deceive us at all. He was just using the vernacular of the day to communicate the truth. And so that is another argument, another arrow maybe that you could shoot into the argument of someone who's going on to say, oh, Moses could never have written it. He wouldn't have even known the term Pharaoh. Well, he probably never penned Pharaoh. Somebody did it later on. Does that make sense? Okay, so the essential authorship of Moses is what I'm promoting. You guys can make up your own mind. You've got a good textbook there to give you a couple of different ideas. Now, because I think it's Moses writing, I also think that the audience is those he led out of Egypt. And Tom was touching on this before. This is so key. These guys had been taken from a small group, a family of about 70, living up in Canaan, into Egypt, and over a period of 400 years had become enslaved by the Egyptians. Now, I've used this analogy before. I'll do it again. If this group here is about 70 of us, if someone from, say, Kazakhstan came and wrapped us all up and took us back to Kazakhstan, how Kazakhstanian do you think our descendants would be in 400 years? Like, pretty Kazakhstanian, right? I don't know if that's how you say it. But Moses, he's led them out of Kazakhstan, or out of Egypt, these Egyptians, basically, Egyptian slaves, and gone, everything you know about God and gods and creation, or wrong. Let me tell you how things went. Okay? And so that's why it's important to understand, because most of them are going to be completely clueless. They've been slaves for 400 years. We don't know anything about our heritage. We don't know anything about our God. Obviously, from Scripture, we know that they were aware of a Hebrew God, but there's nothing to suggest in Scripture that they knew he was the one true God. Because they lived in a culture where there was a pantheon or there was a polytheistic place, which meant there were lots of different gods, and those gods were restricted to geographical locations or temples or elements, maybe the god of the water or the fire or something like that. And so they may have just thought, well, our God is just the God of the Hebrew people. Well, he's no greater or no bigger or better than any other God. Okay, so this is the kind of headspace that they're in. They've just been led out of Egypt. They're in the desert, and Moses goes, "Here, I'm going to tune you guys up." All right, these timelines, I hope these work. I don't know if it's going to work well for you, but we talked about the 5 different portions of history that we're going to hang all our pieces of information on, those characters and events. We've got the prehistory being 4,000 BC right back to however far back you want to go, depending on your concept of origins scientifically. But then you've got 2000 BC, that period of time where Israel was just a family. They were just a family. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then 500 years later, after being held as slave for 400 years in Egypt, you've got 2 million Israelites that are descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. And so there's this loose confederation of Israelites. They've sort of all got their tribe, their 12 different tribes. They're not a nation. They're just a big group of people that have these 12 tribes. And so they get led out of Egypt, obviously, and then into the Promised Land. And then finally, at about 1000 BC, they become a nation. They actually get together, get their act together, get a temple, get a king. And then at around about 500 BC, we've got the process of being exiled into Babylon and then brought back into Jerusalem. So Moses, he exists in this time period, right here. This is where he lives. But in Genesis 1 to 11, he's writing about the prehistory. Okay? So if you look on this side of the map, Moses is down here, but he's actually projecting right back 4,000 years, and then he's covering the prehistory of Israel. That's the content of what's going on. But here's the context. We're Egyptians. So the original Israelite audience, they were the ones that escaped from Egypt, and they're asking, who are we? Where do we come from? Why are we the way we are? Why is the world the way it is? Who or what are the gods? Really confused. And if they were to rely on the other ancient Near Eastern cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt, obviously, because that's where they're from, it's extremely pagan. The concept of personhood is like there's no real value. You're the result of warring gods. You're the accident of gods, or maybe you're just the slave of gods, but there's certainly no dignity offered to the individual or the human individual from the religious context of the ancient Near East. Where do we come from? Well, we're the result of chaos. Again, there's concepts of one god fighting against another god, and there's this story of one god tearing another god in half from the mouth, opening right up, and then the blood fell down and formed the earth, and the guts went up and created the sky. It's just this, it's completely opposite to what we read in Genesis 1 to 11. In the God of order. And why are we the way we are? Well, why is it that all of us think that you should behave a certain way, but none of us behave that way? It's a peculiar question to ask someone who believes that there is no meaning to the world, or there's no ultimate authority to answer to. Why is it then that you expect that people should act or behave in a certain manner? And why is it that you have any expectations of yourself? And then why is it that you let your own expectations down daily? Like, what is wrong with us? If this is just the way we are, why do we even have that question? Why are we even concerned about it? Well, the reality is we are concerned about it, not usually when we break our own values, but when somebody imposes on our personal rights. That's when we start getting upset. So why is the world the way it is? Well, it's the result of chaos, warring gods. We're just essentially, in the grand scheme of things, an insignificant, existence that's basically plagued with suffering for no good reason. And who are the gods? Well, they all come from the mythical stories, but the mythical stories reveal impersonal gods, angry gods, petty gods, gods that need to be appeased. And so again, for the Egyptian Israelite slaves, this is kind of the picture they have of the gods. And they haven't had a great deal of communication from their Hebrew gods, and they're confused. What's going on? All right. So how might the ancient Near Eastern concept of gods and origins impact on the reader of Jesus, the original readers? What in Genesis 1 to 11 would stand out to these particular readers? Have a chat with your table and see what you come up with. Okay. All right, let's see if we can hear from someone that we haven't had a chat to already. So who's... I understand this. We're spending a whole lot more time on context here than we usually would, but given that this is the Pentateuch, the whole book, we're going to be able to do this much faster for Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, because it's all around about the same group of people. Okay, so has anyone got anything for us that's going to be helpful here as a result of your conversation? At the back, Glenn?
Sort of thinking like, it appears like God's got really personal with them from day one. Like people in Genesis, and it's like they almost discuss things with them and even argue with them when they've got to do things they don't want to. It's like it was right there with them. Whereas, like you said before, gods that they kind of knew were just myths and sort of like they were there somewhere, but what they were and who they were was kind of, they didn't know. It was, God in Genesis was right with them the whole time.
Okay, awesome. So now there is a big argument around the narrative genre, specific narrative genre of Genesis 1 to 11, and there's really good arguments, and I think they're great arguments to suggest that Moses was using mythical language to communicate absolute truths. So the way you would tell a story of origins back in the day was through mythical stories. And there's no reason to suggest that just because he was using a mythical form of telling a story that he wasn't telling the truth. But he was telling a story in the way that people would understand it. And then by doing that, he would win people into an audience. Oh, we've heard this is how okay, this is the way you talk about origins. All right, I'm listening. What, a personal God? Every other myth talks about this impersonal, petty gods. This seems to be a very intentional, personal God. Carry on. So that's good. Awesome. Anything else? Yes, Nate.
They're made in the image of God, like they're given a likeness to Him instead of being slaves or a distraction or the result of war or whatever else. They're the result of choice and actually given almost a royalty.
Yeah. So unlike any other mythical story of origins, humans are given the penultimate position in creation. Second only to one, that being God and created in the image of God. Giving people, individuals, dignity. Irrespective of whether or not they're a high-flying Egyptian or a lowly Israelite slave. Okay, good. Anything else? Rod?
In the beginning, God, instead of saying once upon a time.
Now, I've heard some scary stuff about in the beginning. In the past, I heard very clearly, coming from a fundamentalist position, that in the beginning, the word used for in the beginning speaks of a particular point in time, and apparently that's not the case. In the beginning is probably better translated as way back when. Now, what does this do to our, concept around what would you call it? The pre-existence of God. Nothing. Nothing. We don't have to worry about it. Okay, in the beginning, at a particular point in time, or way back when, doesn't really matter. Before everything, that's the concept. God. Exactly. God. So again, this is like that. We're starting to develop a concept of is there like one God? Is there? Okay. Now, but there is some language that can become confusing in the initial chapters. Yeah, speaks of himself in the second person plural. We, or us, or our. Did anyone pick up on that? Yep. Anyone got any answers up the back there?
I just want to know if you think the Bible is correct with the amount of years, 6,000 years, or millions of years. I don't know if we're going to even cover this, but I just love to throw that grenade out.
Yeah. So we're probably going to burn up all our time on that question in a moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So we probably better get a move on, because that's generally what everyone wants to talk about. And I hope, for the people that did this last time, you'll be frustrated that we're doing this again. Because I hope that once we've done it tonight, you'll never worry about it ever again. I genuinely hope that. Because of what we're talking about right now. How many of the ancient Jews, when reading this, or ancient Hebrews, when reading this, were thinking, Moses, so are you saying that it was literally just like the world is like 2,000 years old? Because that's not what the poem's trying to communicate. At no point is there any emphasis on a time frame being something that was important to the original readers. They got completely different questions. They may have asked those questions, but it's like clear from the reading that that's not the point of it. The only time that becomes the point of it is when you try to impose on the scripture something that it's not trying to say. I'll explain it like this. Let's get moving forward a little bit. That's a shame. Such a shame. Such a shame. I'll go back. Don't worry, I'll go back. Okay. If you don't have a paradigm for mathematical equations, and you're all about reading literature, and you come to this whiteboard, all you will see is the letters. And you'll start going, hang on a second. Well, that's a real word. I know that's a real word. And I know A and B are also letters. I'm not quite sure what this business is all about. Hang on. bad might be another word as well. There's an E and an NC. So, and you'll look for things in there that it's just not trying to communicate. But someone who's like savvy with maths goes, "Oh, that's algebra. I know what that's trying to communicate. I know exactly what that's trying to communicate. And it's not English. It's not literature. It's not telling a story. It's not communicating anything about how the emotions of a human being function. This is just maths." But if you're so fixated on thinking in a particular paradigm, that's the problem that you're going to have. Now that's an exaggerated version, obviously, but I've been trying to come up with ideas around how to try and explain this. But it's like a good song. Did we talk about how have you ever seen a musician get frustrated when they're interviewed and somebody says, "Oh, what does this line mean in your song?" And it's like, this song's a big picture, really big, broad picture, and there's not just lyrics, but there's melodies and there's harmonies and there's chord progressions, and then there's your middle eight with a bridge, it's building to something, and then there's a crescendo, and then you wind it out with a soft chorus, and all of these things are working together to help you experience and feel something. And then someone comes along who's got zero capacity to empathise with an artist, and all they want to do is talk about this one line. It's like, that's not what's going on here. Genesis 1 and 2, but 1 especially, it's meant to be something you sit in, and that you relax in, and that you sort of let wash over you, kind of like a song. It's a poem. Now, it may be telling you factually true things and ordered things, but it may not, and that doesn't make it not true. There's the birds and the bees again. It's good, isn't it? If I tried to explain that to a 2-year-old, they're never going to be able to understand it. But if you know this exists, like we know science exists, and then we hear this story, we're going to go, that's not good enough. That's not actually. I want this, right? You sort of picking up what I'm putting down. So we're here. So let's just do it. What a shame. Okay. I've ruined everything. Thanks, Tim. Okay, close your eyes, all right? And I want you to be conscious of the image that pings into your head. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay. Now, how many of you conceptualize the earth like this? Ask yourself the question. How many ancient Hebrews could possibly have conceptualized the earth like this? How long have people been able to have an accurate picture of the globe in their mind? You've seen some dates already up on the board. Okay, 1946, we get a picture of the Earth from outer space. By the 60s, we get one from the moon, but it's not great. And it's not until 1972 that we actually get the first coloured image, like high-res image of the world. That's not that long ago. So can you see how like we're so fixed into certain modes of thinking because that's been our experience, and it just would not have been possible for the ancient Hebrew to think like that. Think about it. When somebody says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, for the ancient Hebrew, what were they thinking? What was their concept of the heavens? The sky. And what was the concept of the earth? The ground. So we're all thinking like globe floating in outer space, and they're thinking dirt, blue thing. That doesn't make them primitive. It's just the context that they had, right? And so when we where is it? I think it's way back here. Yeah. When we try and lay out the days of creation like this, I think we're doing ourselves an injustice. That is not helpful. Because that's not what it's trying to describe. It's not what it's trying to describe. Because no one would understand that. Okay, that's a little more helpful. This is not helpful. an outer space picture that's not in the capacity to understand. That's not too bad. This is good. You can tell this has come from a six-day creationist because they've got their dinosaur in there. I'm not mocking them. I am one, but not because of Genesis 1 and 2. Absolutely not because of Genesis 1 and 2. If it weren't for Exodus and then Genesis 3, probably I would struggle with young earth. But anyway, here we go. This may be a better way to conceptualize things. I don't like that they're in circles because that kind of insinuates globes again. But if you look at day 1 v day 4, it's the light and darkness contrast with the night and day contrast. If you look at days 2 and 5, you've got, water and sky separated. And then you've got water animals and sky animals separated. And then day 3 and day 6, you've got the trees on the land, and then you've got the animals on the land. And so can you see how even, out of order there is a match there? It's almost like there's a verse and a chorus and a verse and it's almost like a song or a poem. Oh, wow, that's right. That's how they even translate it into your Bible, as a poem. And so it's potentially, and it doesn't matter one way or the other if it's not specifically, a myth genre, not calling it a myth, just a way of telling a story about your past that communicates the truth. And the truth isn't focused on how many days and how long, nearly as much as it's focused on who and why. God did it. And He loves us. And this is blowing every concept of God that any Egyptian slave Israelite has had out of the water. And we're still stuck on, does the Hebrew word yom, which is translated as day, mean a 12-hour day, or a 24-hour day, or back in the day, or a day as in like a long period? There's two groups of people that get stuck on this, and I was one of them for a very long time, and I would like to release you from the burden of this, if you are one of them. It is either the fundamentalist Christian or the fundamentalist scientist, anti-atheist, anti-Christian atheist. The fundamentalist Christian who is hell-bent on making the dictation inspiration theory, the ultimate way to afford Scripture authority, will say, well, that's what it says. It happened on that day, so it must be that day. And it's 6 days. Okay, you could be right. I'm not saying you're wrong. You could be right. But keep in mind that your arch nemesis, the fundamentalist scientist, is saying, the Bible is wrong. Because it says on that day there was going to be, plants and trees, and yet God hadn't even made the sun in the sky yet. Okay? It's wrong because I'm approaching it fundamentally completely wrong. It's not trying to give us it's not trying to walk us through the scientific process by which God developed things. Now again, I'm not saying He didn't do it in 6 days. I actually believe He did. I'm just saying that's not what this portion of the Bible is trying to communicate to us. And if we get stuck on it, we miss everything that it's trying to communicate to us. Okay, we're going to waste so much time. But it's good fun, hey? Someone can please push back, and I'm going to let you have the last word and disagree with me so that you know that I'm not just trying to push my agenda. Who would like to disagree? Somebody, please. If you don't believe it, that's fine. You can this is just good stuff to chew on. Yes, Ned.
What do you reckon about evolution?
Okay, so we'll go there. All right, so there seems to be 3 camps from within the Christian world. We've got the young earth creationist. You guys know Ken Ham? Very famous Australian creationist. Probably the most famous Australian creationist. Started in Genesis. He's built a life, like a real life scale version of the Ark somewhere over in America, and like out of cypress and tar. Like it's a real thing. You can Google it. I just like this image because he hated it so much. I didn't do that. I wish I could have. So you've got a young earth creationist, someone who will say that the Bible said that it happened in 6 days, and there's a genealogy that we can count the years of the generations to work it back to around about 6,000 years ago. That's when the world began. Then you've got your older creationist, someone like Hugh Ross. Now, this guy is brilliant. I disagree with him, but he's probably one of the smartest eggs on the planet. Hugh Ross, Hughross. Google this guy. Watch some of his videos. As a 10-year-old with a genius brain, he discovered that God had to exist, just sitting in his own bedroom. This guy's sharp. But he believes that in what's called the day-age theory. Each day was a particular age in our prehistoric history, or prehistoric times. Okay, so there was a certain amount of billion years for day one, a certain amount of billion years for day two, and yada yada yada, and so on and so forth. And then you've got your theistic evolutionists, theos God. So your theistic evolutionist is God guiding evolution. So the God guiding evolution bit is, for me, probably the hardest one to get my head around. Not because he couldn't. And not because you couldn't even read it into the first couple of chapters of Genesis, especially given that he talks about man coming up out of the ground. And, I think the animals, a similar thing, coming up out of the waters, almost as if, the single cell managed to emerge from the primordial soup. You could read that in there if you wanted. You're going to have some dramas, and things go out of order as soon as you go fish and birds in the sky, because birds apparently came after dinosaurs, which are a land animal, so I don't know how you do that one. But anyway, theistic evolutionists, someone like John Polkinghorne, again, another one of the most brilliant minds you've ever come across. His philosophy is outstanding. And yet, he seems to be very happy with the theistic evolution. His theology is great too. Now, why is theistic evolution, in my opinion, the hardest one to get your head around? Let's see, I've got a little list of things to jog my memory. We're way out of order today. Okay, so, Genesis 3 clearly says that sin entered the world with who? Adam. Now, a theistic evolutionist has to say that through the process of natural selection and mutation, years and years of essentially survival of, they don't like survival of the fittest anymore, but survival of the most adapted to its particular climate, had to struggle to progress to the position that it's found itself in its current day, which means years and years and years and years of death and fighting and killing before Adam. And yet sin enters the world with Adam. Now that's a real struggle for me. Now some could say, yeah, but we don't think there's anything wrong with animals killing animals in the wild. That's just natural. And maybe it is. And maybe that is good. Somehow when God says, and it was good, that involved in good is animals killing other animals to survive. And maybe that's true. But any dino doctor will tell you that there's been cancer cells found in the bones of dinosaurs. Now, if dinosaurs, as far as the evolutionary timeline goes, became extinct 65 million years ago, that happens before or at about the same time that Homo sapiens start to turn up, which means that cancer, disease, exists on the earth before Adam. Now that's harder for me to accept, that there was this good world and that it was created before Adam in such a way that not only killing was permissible, but that disease was something that was God considered good. So that's why I have a problem with it. Not because of the poem. The poem doesn't give me 6 days. But certainly Genesis 3, with sin entering the world through Adam, tells me that, well, we didn't have a lot of time before Adam, because that's when death started. Now, the 6 days bit, I actually get from Exodus, when Moses is educating people on the 10 Commandments and keeping the Sabbath. And not in poem, not in narrative, but in law form, the most direct form of literature we get from Scripture, Moses says to the Israelites, listen, God did all this up in 1 week. And then on the last day of the week, he rested. So you're going to have a rest too on the last day of the week. That's far harder for me to argue away that there was anything more than 6 days taking place in that creation week. Now, I could be wrong. I'm totally happy to be wrong. Because again, I don't think Genesis 1:2 is concerned with that right now. I really don't. So, Yeah, does anyone want to push back on that? Maybe that's encouraged a bit more thinking or questioning.
Wouldn't he have thought in terms of 6 days? Because that was the poem that he was writing at the time. So wouldn't he have used that to explain that portion that he was talking about?
From Exodus?
From Exodus, yeah.
So if the same author in poetry was going to talk about it in 6 days, even if he didn't mean 6 literal days, when he's referring back to it, he assumes that his listeners know what he's talking about and it's not actually 6 days. That's the argument that people make to get around it. And it's a good one. Yeah, I just don't buy it, but it's a good argument. Tim, I think you had something?
So when you say semantically add, you're looking at full, yeah. So I can't help but wondering that it talks about how God provided food for Adam.
Yep.
That to me kind of suggests straight up that there already was a meal. Like what happens if Adam didn't eat the food or he didn't die? Right. So does that already mean that it's for Adam?
Okay, so tell me if I'm not getting it right, but so chapter 2 we get a second account of creation. Now this is another good reason why I don't think we need to hang our hats on chapter 1 being the actual literal process of creation. Because you read chapter 2 and God's talking about nothing being created on the earth, and that he had to spring up some plants and bizzo and create a little garden and put Adam and Eve in. Or Adam in originally. And so the chapter 2 directly contradicts the order of chapter 1. Did you pick up on that as you were reading through it? Now, the contradiction loses all its power when you realise that it's not trying to talk about specific orders. It's trying to paint a picture and create something for us that we can sit in and sort of, marinate in and understand that, whoa, there's a God who actually cares about us. And it's actually the intrinsic value we possess is directly linked to the fact that we are an image of his divine nature. That's crazy. And it's crazier for anyone who has been raised in a culture where that is not the way we behave. Now, this is something that we forget. Growing up in the West, whether you're a Christian or not, you grow up with the belief that you are intrinsically valuable. And that you have personal rights, and people can't impede on those rights. But there are cultures existing in the world today where that is not the case. You're born into a class, and you're born into a lower class, and therefore you're not as valuable as the people above you, and you know that to be true. If somebody in that culture learnt that God created them equal to everybody else, mind gets blown. And they're not worrying about how many days it took. They're just like, dang, I don't have to be down here in the dirt anymore. And again, this is something that, is unique in history. There aren't any cultures at this point who've got their head around this. You've got kings and rulers and serfs. That's it. Now you've got a whole nation of people. And as we get on, a couple of months later, they learn that they're all priests. They're meant to be all priests. Like, that's a high calling in the ancient world, right? So I don't even know if I answered your question, except that is to say that if you're going to weigh chapter 2 versus chapter 1, you're going to have problems. Try again if I didn't get anywhere near it.
It just seems like they were going to provide food for Adam before.
Yeah, he provided fruit from the trees. Any fruit that had seed in it they could eat, and then the animals could eat anything green. Okay, so now we're asking questions that we've got zero answers to. If Adam runs into a tree as fast as he can, does it hurt? Yeah, no. Does he? If he jumps off a cliff in Eden, does he die? Yeah. Okay, so, oh man, geez, we could go here. Hey, so the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. Like, we live in a world that seems to be rigged to basically get worse and worse. It's entropy, right? And unless we have an external source sustaining it, it will get worse and worse. So plants die if they don't have the process of photosynthesis, an external body of nitrogen gas feeding the plant. This world dies if we don't have a God feeding the earth. Naturalists will argue that's not the case at all. But that is the way the world exists post the fall. What was happening before the fall? Like if you mowed the grass, did the grass die? Like the bits that you cut off? Ever thought about that? Yeah, no? Yeah, you don't spend enough time mowing your grass then, do you? No one knows. But this does become a very good argument for anyone who wants to say that the natural process of life here today is exactly the same back in Eden, and it was good. So it is good that a lion kills an elk and eats it. That is good. That's, you know, there are people that, Christians, God-loving, Jesus-loving Christians that believe that, and they would say that Eden was not perfect. It doesn't say it was perfect. We impose perfection on Eden because of the illustrations of Eden in heaven, and that we have this picture of heaven being perfect, keeping in mind that heaven's not our final destination, but the new earth is. And so the new earth, we're going to be working on it. What does that look like? Are we tilling the soil again? Are we like cultivating? Does stuff have to die to mulch the ground? I don't know. It's a good question, but I've never heard anyone come close to an answer.
What are you saying?
Yep.
Our interpretation of good isn't right of making it as if it's perfection.
Okay. Oh, this is so good, hey. I love this stuff. I could just go forever. So, we've watered our language, we all know, we water it down. Hey, and I've used these analogies before. When you wake up in the morning, you've had a bad sleep, it was the worst sleep you've ever had. It's like, well, was it really? Because you said that the night before. It was worse than the night before, you know, or it was the best sleep I've ever had. And so when we say good, it's lost its power. Because good used to mean, like there's the standard, good. And now you've got to say really, really good. Or it was perfect to try and reach the same standard. It's funny, I don't know the psychology behind it, but you know when you've got to rate your Uber driver? If you don't give them 5 stars, it's like you've dogged them on something. But 5 stars is kind of what you give someone when it's like, well, you know, that met my expectations. Yeah, 5 stars. Shouldn't that be like 3 stars? And then if they went above and beyond and like stopped in at Macca's and bought you a Big Mac meal on the way or something and then didn't charge, you get 5 stars. I don't know how that works. Sorry? Oh, is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, okay. So they can't be good. They've got to be perfect all the time. Yeah, so I don't know what the Hebrew word for good meant. Did it mean perfection? That's been our understanding for the longest time. But I've tried to immerse myself in as many people that disagree with me as possible, and I've come to understand that good isn't like the ultimate word to describe perfection for the Hebrew. And so it was good meant that it was what God intended. This is the way He intended it. But again, it flies in the face of everything that we get from the ancient Near Eastern religions, which is it was chaos. The beginnings were chaos, and you're all the result of some war that went on up in the heavens, right? So again, we're getting off onto tangents that aren't what I don't think the author is trying to communicate to us. The author is trying to communicate that the Hebrew God is utterly unlike any other God you've ever come across, and He's actually the only God. Keep firing questions if you've got any, or maybe contribute to cover. Dan, we've got 13 minutes.
And I kind of think that, I mean, when you look at the intricacies of how we're made and how everything fits together, I don't think we're meant to understand how it all works.
Yes.
I mean, you know, science tries to explain all that stuff, but
Yep.
I take comfort in thinking God is so much bigger
Yep.
than I can even imagine
Yep.
to create everything so intricately and make it all work together, how plants work and, you know, all of that stuff. I don't need to know that. You know, like I think there's some things that, you know, ask God when you get to heaven.
That sounds like a very Hebrew take on things. No, but I mean it. It's like this story tells them. See, because in the ancient Near East, the gods were a reflection of humanity. This God reveals that humans are a reflection of God. Completely turns the top and tail. And so all of a sudden now, it's like God is so much bigger. We talk about the ontological separation between human beings and God, and there's no good way to explain it other than to say that dirt is the complexity and beauty of dirt to a human would be similar to a human to a God, our God, right? Not to say that we're dirt. It's just to say that He is so utterly other than us That to try and compare ourselves to him is completely pointless. His ways are not our ways. Yeah, well, especially to an angel. Yeah. So I agree. We've got to start to get to the point where we can just be a little bit more humble about how we approach these ancient documents and go, Tim Mackey says it really well like this. I can't remember the exact analogy he uses, but he says something like, have you ever been overseas, say in Paris? Now, he's talking about Americans because he is American. And he goes, and you've found yourself in this little patisserie, and you're quietly observing the culture going on around you, and you're just amazed at the way they do things, and you're sipping on what do they drink coffee? Probably coffee, I don't know. Whatever party people drink. And then you're chewing on a bagel, and it's just like you're just soaking it up, and then you see a tour bus pull up. And then a pile of Americans with, their bum bag and their big hat and their big sunnies and like, hey, yo, where's the McDonald's around here? Now, he's saying it of America himself. I'm not doing it. I'm just repeating what he said. So I'm not hating on the Americans right now. But he says, you shrink, don't you? You go, ooh. Like, they don't even get it. They're in a completely different culture. What are you doing looking for the McDonald's? What are you doing trying to make this America? This isn't America. Go and enjoy Paris. Go and, just be a little bit more humble about things and understand that when you go to a different place, there's a different language to speak, and there's different food to eat, and there's different experiences to be had. And he says, this is what we must do when we step into the Old Testament. We've got to be a bit humble about it and stop thinking that the Western Aussie can get straight into Genesis and go, well, this is what it says. Just be a bit humble for a moment. These are very sophisticated writers. They're not stupid. They're not thinking, oh, I'm going to do the creation account in chapter 1. Oh, that wasn't quite right. I'm going to do it again in chapter 2, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't match the other one. They're not stupid. They're two different points. There's two different things they're trying to communicate there. But at no point are they trying to communicate something that the mind obsessed with scientific process is trying to calculate. Yeah? Okay.
I actually do like science. The fact that they've now discovered we have cells and the probability of organic compounds turning into living cells is
yes. Well, the fault would be to think that God and science still, after hearing this, are in some way incompatible. They're not. Fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist scientists are incompatible. Yes, absolutely. But there is nothing that is. We're right to speak with what's been going on. Scientific discoveries, time and time again, seem to confirm, some divine God who has been intricately involved not only in the creation of the world, but then the sustenance of the world, the sustaining of it. So yeah, they're not at loggerheads, and you'll be encouraged if you do any research on the amount of Christians in the academy. Scientific account that's filled with them, and it's a very loud but small group of mostly biological evolutionists who are the ones that are trying to poke fun at Christianity. David Belinsky is a good guy to read. He's not a Christian, but he makes the claim that biological evolution is the frivolous attempt of scientists to try and take God out of the scientists or something. His book, The Devil's Delusion, I should have had the quote here, it's hilarious. But he basically says, every attempt that they've ever made to try and kick God out hasn't been good enough. But any accusation made against them to suggest that they are doing everything they can to get God out of the scientists, that's bang on. That's what they're trying to do, that's their motivation. So, but then, I don't know.
Point number 1.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we've got time to quickly do this, and then we're not even going to get the themes. This is what I think creation is trying to tell us. There's one God. He's independent of his creation. There's an ontological separation between his creation and the Creator. The Creator, everything else that exists is the created. Angels included. Anything else, the luminaries. Okay? He predates our world. He is personal. He interacts rationally. God created with a word. That's the Latin ex nihilo. And then he also has created man Imago Dei, in his image. This is what is revealed in these stories. This is what the song is trying to tell us. Creation depends on him for its existence. Matter is not eternal. Material world is orderly and good. Sun, moon, and stars are merely lights for the world, not objects of worship. I love this again because remember the gods often were elemental. They would possess a particular element for the ancient Near East. And this is like, this should be able to sort it out for us. What it says that Moses tells us why the moon was put in the sky. Yeah. It's going to light up the sky at night, and then you're going to be able to measure the dates. There's your moon. That's what it's for. Don't worry about the moon dust and the rotation and the separation and that's not what he's trying to communicate. Animal life fulfills God's purpose by reproducing and filling the earth. God likes to recreate. This is a theme that we're going to see time and time again. God is not done with creation. He loves to recreate, loves to see his creation recreate. Humanity is the pinnacle of creation. This is so bizarre for the first readers. Are you kidding me? We're the soul bearers of God's image and animated by his breath. Okay, when the ancient Near East were trying to create an image of a god, what would they use? Sure. Sorry, what images would they use? Sorry. Animals. Yeah, animals. Not our God. Not our God. Definitely not calves. And they didn't get that for a little while. Humans are to work and marry, and it's God's ideal plan. Now, this is hilarious. This is so good. All the psychology says that humans have to work. If they don't work, they go bum straight away. And then the most unhappy people, they're the ones that aren't married. And it's not that marriage makes you happy. It's that you build around you a community. And so you find yourself positioned in a community, and so it's not like you get married to get happy. It's just that if you don't have a community around you by the time you're 80, you're not a very happy human being. Okay, now, look, this isn't necessarily like a broad stroke to paint across every single person. We know that Paul says, hey, if you can live without marriage, it's a good thing. All right? But in a general sense, this is what it's trying to communicate to us. There are things that are God's domain, and that's not open to humans. There are boundaries. Initially, perfect creation and human relationships with God are broken through an act of rebellion that will taint subsequent generations. And here we go, ladies and gentlemen. The question from the Israelites, why are we the way we are? We've got all this good stuff from God. And yes, we're a part of it, and we're in his image, and oh yeah, this is amazing. But the question's still there, so why are we so knackered? Why is stuff still so crap? Well, there's a reason. It's this thing called sin. And essentially sin is whatever you're doing to try and be independent of God. Sin has a price. Paradise has now been lost. The penalty is applied by God, who is the judge as well as the creator. Immortality is off limits, and the sustenance and reproduction of life is now difficult. Childbirth, for instance, and working the ground with thorns and thistles. The rebellion damaged all relationships, human to God, human to human, husband to wife, brother to brother, citizen to citizen, human to earth. And we didn't even get to the rest of Genesis, but it would have been good because we would have seen this design pattern in all the stories where we see how sin affects a man and his wife, then a man's children, and then the way the children interact. And then the sin grows in broader than the family into the community. And then by the end of the story, when we get down to the story of Babel, Tower of Babel, all manner of man on earth are working together to live what? Independent of God. And what was our definition of sin? That which is trying to be independent of God. And so the design pattern in this, you can see it. It's like there's this plume of smoke is getting broader and broader into the sky. The sin is getting broader and broader. It's like sin is affecting the world in every way, shape, or form. And so the Israelites, they understand this. Yes, we've seen that for 400 years. We've seen how this sin thing works. And now we know how we got to here because things were good. But through one individual, the behaviour of the individual, it's the individual here that affects the corporate. And so there's going to be a question left in the heart and mind of the Israelites if they stop at chapter 11. right from the start, God foreshadows his redemptive desire and plan. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. The moment chapter 2 is done, we read in chapter 3 that sin has entered the world, and we get to verse 15, and God says, but I've got a plan. He's a good God. Right from the get-go, God has a plan to fix things. And he said, it's coming from the woman. There's going to be a seed. And so the story goes, she has a baby. Is the baby going to fix things? Oh no, the baby kills his brother. Okay. Well, she has another baby, Seth. And the story starts to follow Seth's line. Did you notice in the genealogies, it's particularly interested in Seth's line and how it gets to Noah. And from Noah's line, it's like, oh, God's cleaned up the whole world. Yes, he's dealt with sin. Awesome. And he says to Noah, what does he say to Noah? The same thing he said to Adam and Eve right at the start. Go and be fruitful. And I was like, oh, let's do it. And so his sons were anyway. And guess what? The world just is knackered again. And so this thread, there's this line, this family line that's followed back to Adam, that's made its way through Noah and then into Shem, and then finally finds itself in the person of Abraham, which is who we're going to talk about next week. And so here's the three big questions. Where do we come from? A good God, and you've been created good. Yeah, but how come everything's so crap? Well, because everyone has a personal choice every day to either do it God's way or do it their own. And every time you do it your own way, it's just going to fall over. Okay, so how do we get fixed? That's the next question, right? Well, the question doesn't get answered in chapter 11, and it only gets partially answered in the next part of the Pentateuch, but that's what we're going to be doing next week. So as you read through Genesis chapters 12 to 50, look for where is this redemptive plan that God talked about back in chapter 3 of Genesis. Where is it starting to work itself out? Because that's the question now Moses is interested in answering for his readers. They know where they came from. They know how they got in. Now they want to know how they can get out of this mess. Okay. Didn't get to even activity 2. Didn't get to any of our themes. But you've got some stuff to read. You've got a textbook there as well. And you've got to go home because it's probably well past. No, it's right on 8:30. Good. Okay, didn't keep anybody up. I'm going to pray. If anyone's got any more questions, you can stick around and have a chat, or you can just go home. I'm going to pray. Father, tonight we talk about things that, I'm suspicious probably frustrate you because it's not your intended message. But where I've stepped out of line, where I've said things that aren't appropriate, where I've encouraged people away from things that you're encouraging people toward, would you just let those words fall to the ground, not stick, and would, in your sovereign power, guide each and every one of us individually on our journey to wherever it is that you need us to go, to be able to reveal to us whatever it is that you want to reveal to us. So Lord, as we continue to move through Genesis, we ask for your control on this whole thing, that I wouldn't hijack it anywhere, but that also we would be able to just be humble and come before your scriptures and let them speak for themselves without imposing our own ideas or our wants and desires on the answers that may not be even getting answered there. Amen. Okay.